The raider I interrogated at Kethrin told me something I couldn't shake for weeks afterward. I hadn't stumbled into a conspiracy. I'd stumbled into a business model. Somewhere above the mid-level facilitators, above the corrupt logistics officer who'd once tried to frame me for his own theft, there was someone patient enough, careful enough, and powerful enough that not even a raider mid-manager had ever met them face to face. My name is Corporal Mason Ithara. Last time, I told you how a Voss clan grievance nearly stripped me out of the Ashguard entirely, how an adjudicator's trial sent me, and a warrior named Ithara crawling through a maintenance shaft beneath a raider staging base, and how the intelligence we recovered there cracked open a theft ring running clean through coalition supply lines across 6 systems. I thought that operation closed the book. It didn't. It opened the next chapter, one that would take Commander Vann's Ashguard regiment further from home than any of us had planned to go, put names to faces that had spent over a year staying carefully invisible, and force me to answer a question I hadn't expected to face this soon. How far was I actually willing to go to protect people who, 6 months ago, would have killed me on sight for wearing their colors without permission? This is the story of the reckoning beyond the belt. It gets ugly before it gets better. Stick around. The NAMES we had. 3 weeks after the Council certified my place in the Ashguard permanently, Coalition intelligence finally finished cross-referencing the 2 names we'd pulled from the Kethrin prisoner against 6 systems worth of supply manifests, transaction logs, and personnel records. What came back wasn't the clean, satisfying answer any of us had hoped for. The 2 mid-level facilitators, a logistics contractor named Devereaux and a shipping coordinator named Vann, had both been dead for over a year, their identities apparently repurposed as clean cover credentials for whoever actually moved product through the network now. Ghosts wearing dead men's paperwork. Whoever was running things had learned, a long time ago, that names got people caught, and had simply stopped using real ones anywhere an investigator might eventually look. "This is a professional operation," Vann said, studying the intelligence brief in the Pharaoh command room, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "Not a raider syndicate that grew large by accident. Someone built this deliberately, layer by layer, specifically to survive exactly the kind of investigation we just conducted." "Which means Kethrin wasn't a lucky break for them," I said. "It was an acceptable loss. They probably built in redundancy assuming a node would get rolled up eventually." "Then the secondary facility coordinates you recovered," Thressa said. She'd remained at Pharaoh longer than her original mandate required, citing an ongoing interest in the operation's outcome that I suspected had more to do with genuine curiosity than official duty. "May simply be another disposable node. Or it may be the first structure in this network built to actually protect something worth protecting." "Only one way to find out," Rask said. Vann's eyes moved around the room, myself, Rask, Ithara, Corvala, Thressa, before settling back on the intelligence brief. "Coalition Command wants this handled quietly. A cross-system raider network implicating Coalition supply officers is not the kind of story High Command wants dominating headlines, while the Voss Alliance renewal talks are underway next quarter, which means this operation does not get the resources Kethrin had. No honor guard. No council adjudicator standing over our shoulder, just us." "Suits me fine," Rask said. "Council adjudicators make for uncomfortable company in the field." Thressa's expression flickered with something almost like amusement. "I will pretend I did not hear that, Sergeant." The facility beyond the belt. The secondary facility sat on a moon designated only by a survey catalog number, tucked into the outer edge of a System 2 resource bore to have ever attracted formal coalition attention. That, I was beginning to understand, was exactly the point. Whoever built this network had a genuine talent for finding the gaps between jurisdictions, places nobody bothered patrolling because nobody had a reason to. Long-range scans, run quietly over the better part of a week by a coalition recon ship operating under civilian registry to avoid tipping anyone off, painted a picture considerably more sophisticated than the rusted skeleton of the Kethrin refinery. This was a purpose-built facility, buried into the moon's rock under enough shielding to mask its thermal signature from anything less patient than a week-long survey. Whoever ran it had resources. Real ones. "This isn't Raiders anymore," I said, laying the scan data across the briefing table for what felt like the 15th time that week, still looking for details I might have missed. Raiders don't build shielded, buried facilities with this kind of construction quality. This is somebody with actual capital, actual engineering resources. Corporal said, "It wasn't a question." "Or a coalition contractor with a black budget nobody's auditing properly," I said. "Either way, whoever's behind this has been operating a lot longer and a lot more carefully than a raid or syndicate skimming supply requisitions ever could on its own." Vann studied the facility's schematic reconstructed from scan data, incomplete in places but detailed enough to plan around. 3 access points, a primary landing bay, clearly designed for legitimate cargo traffic, which tells me this facility maintains a legal cover operation on the surface. A secondary maintenance access, buried deeper, likely restricted to actual network operations. And this, she tapped a section of the schematic that had confused all of us during initial analysis, an unmarked structure roughly 200 meters beneath the primary facility, connected by what our scans suggest is a reinforced elevator shaft. No thermal signature consistent with standard operations. No obvious purpose. "That's where I'd keep anything I didn't want found," I said. "If the surface facility gets raided, whatever's 200 meters down survives the raid completely undisturbed." "Then that is our actual objective," Thressa said. "Not the surface operation, whatever they have buried beneath it. The cover operation. Getting eyes on the surface facility without triggering an alert required patience the Ashguard, by reputation and by nature, didn't traditionally practice." Vann's solution was elegantly simple and made every warrior in the room visibly uncomfortable in a way I found almost endearing, 6 months into understanding how this unit actually worked. "We go in as cargo," she said. "Explain," Rask said flatly. "The surface facility maintains a legal cover, a mineral processing operation, according to the registry filed with the local system authority. Legal cover operations still need supply runs. Coalition civilian freight moves through this sector regularly enough that a single additional transport won't draw attention, provided the manifest looks legitimate and the crew doesn't give anyone a reason to look closer." "You want us posing as freight haulers," Ithara said, something skeptical in her tone. "I want 6 of us posing as freight haulers, delivering a shipment their own registry shows they're expecting within the week," Vann said. "Mason handles the ship's transponder spoofing and manifest forgery. The rest of us get inside the primary facility, establish what we're actually dealing with, and locate the access point to whatever's buried beneath it. Once we have that, the remainder of the team moves in for the actual extraction." "You want me to forge a manifest good enough to fool a facility built by people paranoid enough to bury their real operation 200 meters underground," I said. "Can you?" "Given a few days and access to whatever legitimate shipping data coalition intelligence can pull on this facility's actual registered supplier, yes, probably. I'm not going to pretend that's not a nerve-wracking probably, though." "Nervous and correct is an acceptable combination," Thressa said. "I have found it to be your natural operating state, Corporal." "The forgery." "I spent the better part of 4 days buried in freight manifests, supplier registries, and transponder protocols, cross-referencing everything coalition intelligence could dig up on the facility's legitimate mineral processing cover against genuine shipping patterns from similar operations across the sector. The margin for error was uncomfortably thin. A manifest that looked almost right would draw more suspicion than one that looked completely wrong, because almost right invited scrutiny in a way that obvious fraud sometimes didn't. Ithara spent most of those 4 days at my side, ostensibly assigned to review the forged documentation for anything that might read as unnatural to someone actually working the facility's supply chain, though I suspected Vann had assigned her specifically, because the two of us worked well together in close, sustained proximity, a fact neither of us had directly acknowledged since the Kethrin extraction. "Your supplier reference codes are inconsistent," she said, on the third day, tapping a section of the manifest I'd been staring at for the better part of an hour. "This facility's registered supplier uses a 6-digit batch code. Yours drifts to 7 digits on the second page." "You're right," I said, correcting it. "How'd you catch that? You've never worked freight manifests before this week." "I did not catch it from experience," she said. "I catch it because I have spent 4 days watching you build this document one careful piece at a time, and I have learned to notice when a piece does not match the pattern you have otherwise been extremely disciplined about maintaining." "That's either a compliment or you're telling me I'm predictable." "Perhaps both," she said, and there was something warmer in her tone than the flat, evaluating cadence I remembered from our first weeks together. "I do not consider predictability a flaw in you, Mason. Rask predicts your instincts well enough now that she stopped questioning them 3 engagements ago. I find I have started doing the same." "That's either the nicest thing you've said to me, or the most Voss way of saying something nice I've ever heard." "It is likely both of those as well," she said, and went back to reviewing the manifest, though I caught the ghost of something almost like a smile at the edge of her expression before she did. By the 4th day, the manifest was as clean as 4 days of careful, paranoid work could make it. A legitimate-looking mineral processing equipment shipment. Transponder codes spoofed to match a real, currently-in-transit coalition freight hauler whose actual route intelligence had confirmed wouldn't intersect with the facility's system for another 3 weeks, giving us a clean window before anyone might notice the discrepancy. "It's as good as I can make it," I told Vann, presenting the final documentation. "If their supply chain security is even moderately competent, this should pass initial inspection. If they're paranoid enough to cross-reference transponder history against actual fleet movement logs in real time, we're going to have a very bad day." "Then we move quickly enough that a bad day does not have time to develop," Vann said. "We depart within the hour." The landing bay. The freighter, a genuine coalition civilian hauler that intelligence had quietly requisitioned for the operation, crewed by myself, Vann, Rask, Ithara, Corvala, and a 6th Ashguard warrior named Dissa whose specialty in infiltration work I hadn't previously had reason to appreciate, approached the moon's primary facility exactly on the schedule my forged manifest promised. The landing bay's automated traffic control accepted our transponder code without incident, guiding us into a docking berth alongside 2 other freighters already unloading legitimate mineral processing cargo. For a facility built on top of a hidden, shielded structure 200 meters underground, the surface operation looked almost aggressively mundane. Tired dock workers, standard-issue loading equipment, the specific low-grade boredom of people doing genuinely unremarkable work. "Keep the cargo manifest ready," Vann murmured, as the bay's dock supervisor approached our ramp, data pad in hand, radiating the exact bureaucratic weariness of someone who'd checked 1,000 shipments before ours and expected this one to be equally unremarkable. "Manifest," the supervisor said, holding out a hand without looking up from his own tablet. I passed the forged documentation across, doing my best impression of a freight hauler who'd made this exact delivery a dozen times before, and found the entire process too routine to bother being nervous about. He scanned it, cross-referenced something on his own tablet, and for one uncomfortably long moment simply stared at the screen without saying anything. "Processing equipment," he said finally. "Second shipment this month. Someone upstairs decided to double the order." "Above my pay grade," I said, keeping my voice level. "I just fly the route they give me." He grunted, the universal sound of a man who'd long ago stopped questioning decisions made by people he'd never meet, and waved us through. "Unload at Bay 4. Someone will inspect the crates before you get your release signature." It took every ounce of discipline I had not to visibly exhale. Inside the facility, the inspection at Bay 4 passed without incident. Our forged crates, packed with genuine mineral processing components sourced from an actual coalition supplier, specifically to survive exactly this kind of scrutiny, satisfied the facility's cargo inspector without comment. What mattered more was what the delay bought us. Nearly 40 minutes of legitimate reason to be walking the primary facility's corridors, ostensibly overseeing the unloading process, actually mapping every access point our scan data had left incomplete. Ithara found the maintenance access to the buried structure almost by accident, a service corridor branching away from the main processing floor toward what the facility's posted signage labeled, blandly, as restricted structural integrity monitoring. No mineral processing operation needed structural integrity monitoring, buried 200 meters beneath its own foundation. That was a cover story written by someone who hadn't expected anyone patient enough to actually walk the corridor and ask why. "Here," she said quietly, tracing the outline of a reinforced door set into the corridor's far end, its security paneling considerably more sophisticated than anything else we'd seen on the surface level. "This is not structural monitoring equipment, Mason. This lock is coalition military grade." Which means whoever built this facility either stole military-grade security hardware or has connections deep enough inside coalition procurement to acquire it legitimately, I said, studying the panel. "Neither option is good news." "Can you open it?" "Given time, probably. Given the 40 minutes we have left before someone notices we're wandering corridors we have no cargo business being in, I'm not confident." Vann's voice came through the short-range comm unit tucked into my collar, pitched low. "Report." "Found the access point," I said. "Military-grade lock. I need more time than we currently have to crack it without tripping an alarm." A pause. "Then we do not crack it today," Vann said. "We confirm the location, complete the cargo delivery, and return properly equipped. I would rather lose the element of a single visit than lose the entire operation to a rushed door." It was, I'd come to understand, exactly the kind of patient, disciplined restraint that had kept the Ashguard's reputation intact across 4,000 years of vast military history. The willingness to walk away from an open door rather than risk everything forcing it open a moment too soon. The second visit. Coalition intelligence took 9 days to source a portable decryption rig, sophisticated enough to crack military-grade coalition security hardware, without also alerting whatever monitoring system that hardware reported back to. A genuinely uncomfortable irony, given that the lock itself had almost certainly been stolen, or otherwise acquired, from the same coalition supply chain we were trying to protect. The second infiltration ran the same forged manifest playbook, a follow-up delivery scheduled precisely enough to avoid arousing suspicion about our freighter's return so soon after the first visit. This time, the moment our cargo inspection began at Bay 4, Ithara and I peeled away toward the maintenance corridor while Rask, Corvala, Dissa, and Vann maintained the cover operation on the surface, ready to move the instant we called for backup. The decryption rig took 11 minutes to work through the reinforced door security layers. 11 of the longest minutes I'd experienced since the Raider assault on Pharaoh, standing in a service corridor with Ithara covering the approach, both of us acutely aware that a facility security patrol wandering past at the wrong moment would end this operation immediately and badly. The door finally released with a soft hydraulic hiss, revealing a service elevator shaft descending further into the moon's rock than our scan data had originally suggested. 200 meters, Ithara murmured, studying the shaft's depth indicator. Perhaps more. Only one way to find out what's actually down there. We descended in tense silence, the elevator's dim internal lighting casting long shadows across the shaft walls, until it finally opened onto a level that bore no resemblance whatsoever to the mundane mineral processing operation 200 meters above. What was buried beneath? The buried structure wasn't a warehouse. It wasn't a staging base, or a secondary raider hub, or anything resembling the kind of criminal infrastructure I'd expected based on everything Kethrin had taught me about how this network operated. It was a research facility, clean, climate-controlled, humming with the low mechanical whir of equipment far more sophisticated than anything I'd seen on a coalition military budget, let alone a raider syndicate's black market resources. "This isn't theft," I said quietly, moving through the facility's outer corridor, passing sealed laboratory doors labeled with designations I didn't immediately recognize. "This is development. Someone's building something down here." Ithara's expression, usually carefully composed, had gone tight with something I recognized as genuine alarm. "Mason, look." She'd stopped in front of a viewing window set into one of the laboratory doors, and through the reinforced glass, I could see rows of containment cylinders, each holding what looked, unmistakably, like modified plasma core casings. The exact same experimental cores that had gone missing from my depot on Calder's Reach, the theft that had started this entire chain of events, except these weren't stolen inventory awaiting resale. They were being actively reverse-engineered. "They didn't steal those cores to sell them," I said, the pieces sliding into place with an unpleasant, cold clarity. "They stole them to study them. The raids, the theft ring, all of it, that's not the operation. That's the funding mechanism. This is the actual operation. Reverse engineering experimental coalition weapons technology," Ithara said. "For what purpose?" "I don't know. But whoever's running this has resources, patience, and technical expertise that goes well beyond Raider Syndicate. This is a state-level operation, or close enough to one that the distinction barely matters." A voice, calm and unhurried, spoke from behind us. "I was rather hoping you two would find your way down here eventually. It's taken you longer than I expected, honestly." "The mastermind." I turned, rifle already coming up, to find a figure standing in the corridor's far entrance, human, mid-50s, wearing the kind of understated civilian attire that suggested significant wealth, deliberately dressed down to avoid drawing attention. He made no move toward a weapon, his hands remaining loosely clasped in front of him, radiating the specific calm of someone who had planned for exactly this moment, and found it far less threatening than we did. "Dr. Aldrich Farron," he said, by way of introduction, as though we were meeting at a coalition science conference rather than 200 meters beneath a fraudulent mineral processing facility. "Formerly of Coalition Advanced Weapons Research, before certain funding disagreements encouraged me to pursue my work through more independent channels. And you, Corporal Edo, are considerably more resourceful than the initial theft investigation gave you credit for." I confess I didn't expect the man I framed for my own supply diversion to eventually track the entire operation back to its source. "You framed me," I said, the cold certainty settling into place even as some part of me had already suspected it. "Regrettably, yes. Nothing personal, Corporal. I needed a name on that authorization signature, and you were, administratively speaking, the most convenient one available. I assumed the matter would resolve itself quietly, the way these things usually do. I did not anticipate you'd end up recruited into an Ashguard war sisterhood and personally dismantling two of my staging operations within a single year. That's rather extraordinary, actually. I may need to revise several assumptions in my research." "What are you actually building down here?" Ithara asked, her weapon steady despite the tension visibly coiled through her frame. "Something the Coalition lacked the vision to fund properly," Farron said. "Experimental plasma cores, properly modified, represent the foundation of a next-generation defense architecture that could render current raider and pirate threats across this entire sector obsolete within a decade. Coalition High Command saw only the immediate cost and killed the program. I saw the opportunity to complete the research through other means. The theft ring, the raider network, all of it, simply funding mechanisms for work that should have been properly resourced from the start. You've gotten people killed, I said. Colonists at outposts your raiders hit. Survey teams that went dark. A Voss commander who nearly bled out in a courtyard because of the network you built to fund this. Regrettable, Farron said, and something in the flatness of the word told me he meant it about as much as he'd meant the earlier apology for framing me. Progress rarely comes without cost, Corporal. I'd have thought a species with your particular evolutionary talent for enduring hardship would understand that better than most. Ithara moved before I could respond, closing the distance with the same brutal, economical speed I'd seen her use against the raider trooper at Kethrin. But Farron, for all his calm academic detachment, was faster than either of us expected. A concealed sidearm clearing its holster in a motion too practiced to belong to a research scientist alone. The facility collapses. The first shot went wide, scoring a molten line across the corridor wall as Ithara threw herself sideways, and I returned fire on instinct, catching Farron's shoulder and spinning him back against the laboratory door behind him. He didn't go down easily. Whatever augmentation or preparation he'd invested in alongside his research, it made him considerably harder to put down than his civilian appearance suggested. Facility security, he gasped into a wrist-mounted comm unit, even as blood soaked through his shoulder. Intrusion, lower level, lethal force authorized. I closed the distance and put him down with a second, more decisive shot before he finished the sentence. And the alarm that had already begun blaring through the corridor told me the message had gone through regardless. "We need to move," Ithara said, already pulling me toward the elevator shaft. "Facility security will be here within minutes." "The research," I said, glancing back at the containment cylinders visible through the laboratory viewport. "If we leave this intact, someone else picks up where Farron left off." "Then we do not leave it intact," Ithara said, already working the access panel beside the laboratory door. "But we do it quickly, Mason. I would prefer not to die 200 meters underground on a moon nobody bothered naming." I got the laboratory door open, found the containment S. Ustum's overload protocol exactly where every properly engineered research facility keeps one. A failsafe, designed to prevent catastrophic containment breach, which I now intended to trigger deliberately for exactly the opposite reason it was built. The plasma core casings, still in their early reverse engineering stage, wouldn't detonate the way a completed weapon might, but the resulting containment overload would be more than sufficient to destroy over a year of research beyond any hope of recovery. 60 seconds, I called, setting the failsafe timer. "Move." We made it into the elevator shaft with security forces already converging on the level below, the doors sealing behind us just as the first pursuit reached the corridor we'd vacated. The ascent felt agonizingly slow, every second stretching taut with the knowledge that Farron's security detail, however small, now knew exactly where we were headed. The extraction. "Vann, we've got a problem," I said into the comm the moment the elevator doors opened onto the primary facility's maintenance corridor. "Facility security is active, lower level compromised. We need extraction now." "Already moving," Vann's voice came back, tight with barely restrained urgency. "Rask has cleared a path to Bay 4. Korvala is prepping the freighter for immediate departure." The run back through the surface facilities corridors was chaos in the specific, controlled way that Ashguard operations tended toward chaos. Precise, violent, and over faster than the confusion suggested it should be. Facility security, clearly better equipped than the average raider muscle, but nowhere near prepared for an actual Ashguard extraction team moving with lethal intent. Folded faster than I expected, though not before Dissat took a glancing plasma burn across her forearm that she shrugged off with the same flat disregard I'd come to expect from every warrior in the unit. We hit the freighter's ramp at a dead run, Corvala already cycling the engines before the last of us had cleared the bay doors, and the moon's gravity well fell away behind us as the facility's surface alarm continued blaring uselessly into a bay we'd already abandoned. "Report," Vann said, once we'd cleared the system's immediate pursuit range, the freighter settling into a burn that would carry us back toward Coalition-controlled space. "Farron's dead," I said. "The man behind the network, turns out he wasn't Raider leadership at all. He was a Coalition weapons researcher running the entire theft ring as a funding mechanism for reverse engineering experimental plasma technology. I destroyed his primary research cache before extraction. It's not perfect. There may be backup data somewhere we haven't found, but the physical research is gone." Vann was quiet a long moment, processing. "You are certain he was acting alone, no larger conspiracy behind him?" "I don't know," I admitted. "He talked like someone who genuinely believed he was solving a problem Coalition bureaucracy was too short-sighted to fund properly. That's not the profile of someone working for a larger organization. That's the profile of someone convinced of their own righteousness. But I could be wrong." "Then Coalition intelligence will need to determine the rest," Thressa said, from where she'd remained aboard the freighter throughout the entire operation, her expression unreadable as always. "You have done what this operation required of you, Corporal. The rest belongs to people whose job is untangling conspiracies, not warriors whose job is ending them." The salvage team. 3 days after our return to Faro, Coalition intelligence dispatched a forensic salvage team to what remained of the moon facility, hoping to recover anything the containment overload hadn't destroyed. I wasn't part of that operation. My presence had already been flagged in enough classified reports for one fiscal quarter, according to a liaison officer who seemed almost apologetic about the paperwork constraints. But Vann insisted I sit in on the debrief when the team's preliminary findings came back, on the grounds that I understood the research architecture better than anyone else who'd actually seen it firsthand. "The lower level is a near-total loss," the salvage lead reported over a secure channel, her voice carrying the particular fatigue of someone who'd spent 3 days picking through slagged containment cylinders. "Whatever overload protocol you triggered, Corporal, it did its job thoroughly. We're recovering fragments, not functional data. Most of what's left is going to take weeks of lab analysis just to confirm what it used to be, let alone reconstruct anything usable." "Anything on Farron himself?" Vann asked. "Personal effects, communication logs, anything indicating whether he had contact with anyone outside the facility beyond the Raider network we've already traced." "A partial data core, recovered from a personal terminal in what looks like his private court." The salvage lead said. "Encrypted, obviously, and partially damaged, but Intelligence's cryptography division thinks they can pull something usable within the month. I'll flag you both the moment we have results." "Appreciated," Vann said and closed the channel. "You don't sound optimistic," I said. "I have learned not to invest optimism in data cores that take a month to crack," Vann said. "By the time results arrive, whatever they reveal will be a month stale. If Farron left behind any contingency, a partner, a dead man's trigger, a second facility we have not yet found, a month is more than enough time for it to activate without us noticing until it is already too late to matter." It was, I'd come to learn, exactly the kind of grim, practical patience that had kept the Ashguard's operational record as clean as it was across 4,000 years of vast military history, never assuming an ending was final until proven otherwise, and planning around the worst-case assumption regardless. What IT cost? The mission debrief once we returned to Faro ran considerably longer and considerably less triumphant than the aftermath of Kethrin had felt. Farron's death, however necessary in the moment, closed off an entire line of investigation that Coalition intelligence had hoped to pursue: funding sources, additional research sites, the full scope of who else might have known about or benefited from his work. We'd stopped the immediate threat. We hadn't fully unraveled it. "You did the correct thing," Vann told me, finding me in the maintenance bay late that evening, working through a sled repair that didn't strictly need my attention, but gave my hands something to do while my mind worked through everything that had happened. A live research cache, actively being pursued by facility security, in the middle of an extraction under fire. There was no version of that moment that allowed for a cleaner resolution. "I know," I said. "Doesn't make it feel clean, though." "It rarely does," Vann said, settling onto the workbench beside me, her considerable frame dwarfing the standard Coalition issue seating the way it always did. "I have ended threats across 4 decades of service, Mason. I have never once found the ending satisfying in the way I expected it to feel beforehand. There is always a thread left hanging, always a question that dies with the person who could have answered it." "How do you carry that? 4 decades of unsatisfying endings." "You carry it the same way you carried Ithara out of that barracks with a cracked chest plate," Vann said. "By choosing, deliberately, each time, that an imperfect resolution which keeps your people alive is worth infinitely more than a perfect one that costs you everything." She studied me a long moment. "You are troubled by more than the incomplete investigation, I think." I set down my tools, finally, and admitted the thing I'd been avoiding since the elevator ride back to the surface. Farron said something, before Ithara moved on him, about my species' talent for enduring hardship. Like the entire theft ring, the raids, all of it, was just an acceptable cost on the way to something he considered progress. I keep thinking about how easily people like that decide who gets to pay that cost. "Then remember what he became in the end," Vann said. "A man who justified violence against strangers for the sake of an abstraction, facing 2 people who had chosen, specifically and deliberately, to protect each other instead. He lost, Mason. Not because his research lacked merit, perhaps. He lost because he built his entire operation on the assumption that no one on the other side of his calculations mattered enough to fight for. He was wrong about that in our case, in a way that cost him everything." Ithra's answer. "I found Ithara later that same night, on the upper gantry overlooking Pharaoh's motor pool. The same spot, I realized, where Vann and I had once sat during my very first week in the unit, the night she'd told me that everyone has a choice, and that I'd simply made the harder one." "You are still awake," Ithara observed, as I settled beside her. "Same could be said of you." "I find sleep difficult after an operation like that one." She was quiet a moment, studying the dark tree line beyond Pharaoh's perimeter fence. "You asked me a question before the Kethrin mission, about why I took those rounds meant for you. I told you to ask again once I was no longer confined to a medical frame." "I remember. I am no longer confined to a medical frame." I turned to look at her properly, and something in her expression, carefully composed, the way it usually was, but with an undercurrent I hadn't seen from her before, told me this wasn't a conversation she was entirely comfortable having, even now. "Ask me again, Mason. Why'd you take those rounds?" "Because the mission required it, as I said before," she said. "That is true. It is also incomplete. I took them Because in the moment the trooper's weapon came up, I understood, with a clarity I did not expect, that I would rather absorb that damage myself than watch it find you instead. That is not doctrine. Voss doctrine values the mission above any single warrior's safety, including my own. What I felt in that moment was not doctrine. It was something considerably more difficult for me to name." "You don't have to name it tonight." "I am aware," she said. "I am choosing to attempt it regardless, because I have found that I am tired of the careful distance the Ashguard maintains around matters like this, and I do not believe you have ever particularly respected careful distance in the first place." "That's fair," I admitted. "I've never been great at careful distance." "No," she agreed, something almost warm bleeding through her translated tone. "You are not. I find, somewhat to my own surprise, that I do not wish you to start now." Neither of us said anything else for a long while after that, and neither of us needed to. Matriarch Kor's message. A transmission arrived from the Voss homeworld 2 weeks after the Moon facility operation, routed through the same Council liaison channel that had once carried Matriarch Kor's formal grievance against my presence in the Ashguard. This time, the message was addressed to me directly, rather than to Commander Vann on my behalf, which was itself unusual enough that I read it twice before fully processing the contents. "Corporal Ito," it began, Kor's translated voice carrying the same measured authority I remembered from the courtyard confrontation months earlier. "Word of the operation beyond the belt has reached the Council through coalition diplomatic channels, considerably embellished, I suspect, in the retelling. I do not require embellishment to recognize the shape of what occurred. A rogue researcher, funding violence against Voss and Terran colonists alike in pursuit of a private ambition, was stopped by a strike team that included a warrior my own clan's once petitioned to have removed by force of law." I kept reading, uncertain where the message was headed. "I will not pretend the exclusion clause I once invoked against you was without merit, Corporal. 4,000 years of pack law exists because outsiders have, historically, often proven exactly the liability our traditions warn against. You have proven, twice now, to be the exception rather than the rule. I do not offer this observation as an apology. Matriarchs do not apologize for enforcing law that existed before either of us was born. I offer it as an acknowledgement that Thressa Van Ol's judgment, in certifying your place within the Ashguard, has been vindicated considerably more thoroughly than even she likely anticipated. The Council will not trouble Commander Vann's unit with further grievances regarding your presence. You have earned that peace, whatever its cost to the traditions that once stood against you." The message ended there, formal and clipped in the specific way I'd learned characterized nearly all official Voss communication, but I found myself sitting with it far longer than its brevity strictly warranted. "You seem troubled by good news," Vann observed, finding me still staring at the terminal an hour later. "Not troubled," I said, "just surprised. I didn't expect Kor to ever soften on this." "Matriarchs do not soften, Mason," Vann said. "They recalculate when the evidence demands it, and then proceed as though the recalculation was obvious from the start. It is a particular Voss talent, born from 4,000 years of needing to adapt without ever appearing to have been wrong in the first place." Something almost fond crossed her scarred features. "Kor respects you more than her message allows her pride to state directly. That is, in its own way, a considerably higher compliment than an apology would have been." "I'll take it," I said. "I've learned to take what this culture offers instead of what I expected to offer. Seems to work out better that way." "It generally does," Vann agreed. The report. Coalition Intelligence's final assessment of the Farron operation, filed 3 weeks later, confirmed what I'd suspected but couldn't prove in the moment. Farron had, in fact, been operating largely alone, using a network of dead man's identity facilitators and raider muscle to fund research he genuinely believed the coalition would eventually thank him for, once completed. No larger conspiracy. No hidden backers pulling strings from further up the chain. Just one man, brilliant and patient and thoroughly convinced of his own righteousness, willing to let an entire theft ring's worth of violence ripple outward as an acceptable cost on the way to a breakthrough he never lived to complete. It wasn't the tidy ending anyone had hoped for. It was, I'd come to understand over the better part of a year now, closer to how these things actually resolved in practice, messy, partial leaving Thria. DS that would probably never be fully tied off. The Coalition officer who'd originally framed me on Calder's Reach turned out to be one of several minor facilitators Farron had recruited and discarded across the network's lifetime, arrested along with a dozen others in the weeks following Kethrin. Their small-scale greed simply one gear in a much larger machine none of them had fully understood. "You look like a man deciding whether an ending counts as a victory," Rask observed, finding me in the armory reviewing the final report. "Does it?" "I have stopped asking that question about most operations," Rask said, settling onto the bench beside me with the same easy familiarity that had replaced the open hostility of my first weeks in the unit. "Farron is dead. His research is destroyed. The theft ring that framed you and funded his work is dismantled. Colonists who would have died in future raids will not die in those raids now. That is not everything, Mason. It is considerably more than nothing." "When you get so philosophical, Sergeant." "Around the time a Terran engineer taught half this unit that strength is not the only currency worth having," Rask said, and something in her tone suggested she meant it as more of a compliment than her usual flat delivery let on. "Commander Vann wishes to see you, once you have finished sulking over paperwork that will not change regardless of how long you stare at it." "What comes next?" Vann was waiting in the command room, a new dispatch already queued on the main terminal, a formal request from Coalition High Command, forwarded through the Voss Alliance Liaison Office, requesting the Ashguard's participation in an expanded joint task force, specifically designed to investigate remaining threads from the Farron network across the 6 systems it had touched. "They want us again," I said, reading the dispatch. "They want you specifically named in the operational mandate," Vann corrected. "Coalition High Command has apparently decided that a Terran engineer attached to an Ashguard war sisterhood, twice now responsible for unraveling a conspiracy that embarrassed several senior officers, is worth formalizing rather than continuing to treat as an administrative anomaly." "How do you feel about that?" "I feel that Peterson's typo, or whatever administrative error originally sent you into my barracks, has produced considerably more value than any reasonable person had any right to expect," Vann said, something that might have been the Voss equivalent of dry humor bleeding through her usual flat command tone. "I also feel that this task force will not be the last thread from Farron's network we encounter. A man patient enough to build what we found beneath that moon rarely operates with only a single contingency in place." "You think there's more?" "I think," Vann said, "that every ending we have found so far has, upon closer examination, turned out to be another beginning. I have stopped expecting otherwise. I have instead started expecting that whatever comes next, this unit, and you, specifically Mason, will meet it the same way we have met everything since a clerical error first put you in front of my staging area. Directly, without flinching, and together." I looked around the command room, Rask reviewing tactical projections in the corner, Ithara standing near the doorway with an expression that held considerably more warmth than the careful distance she'd once maintained, Thressa's final transmission still queued on a side terminal, confirming her return to the Voss homeworld with a formal council recommendation attached to my name that would follow me for the rest of my service, however long that turned out to be. "Together works for me, Commander," I said. "Good," Vann said, "because Coalition High Command's dispatch indicates the task force convenes within the week, and something tells me Farron's network was never quite as contained as we would like to believe." Corporal Mason Ito uncovered something far larger than a raider theft ring this time, a rogue coalition researcher's private war, funded by violence he considered an acceptable cost for progress. He ended it the only way that mattered, standing beside people who refused to let him carry that cost alone. But every ending in this story has turned out to be another beginning. Somewhere across 6 systems, Farron's network still has threads Coalition intelligence hasn't traced yet, and Mason's next chapter is already being written. If you've made it this far into the Ashguard story, thank you for sticking with Mason, Vann, Rask and Ithara through 3 chapters now. Smash that like button, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next, and let me know in the comments. What should the Joint Task Force uncover in Part 4?